continuing on Sunday, the 24th of July, they're going to actually feel that that was a clip that was used of historic value in the motion picture. In fact, they may even conclude that the entire motion picture is about somebody if they only had parts of it and didn't see it completely as a fabrication. In any event, what we've done is we've created something archaeologists in years hence will look at as absolute truth because there's a record of it and there's no way to distinguish the fantasy from the reality. Why is this? Because there's no such thing as objective reality. When we try to document objective reality, we're always going to fall short. We're going to fall short because no matter how many different ways we measure it, there'll always be ways that we aren't measuring it. For example, we aren't measuring everything that happened in a person's life without a break, without a cut, without an edit. We don't have a simulation that starts someone out at the moment of birth and follows them with video and audio, anything within the realm that they could be seen in, anything within the realm of what they could see, and create from that a record of their lives. Instead, we have little flash segments that are recorded. And those flash segments then allow for gaps. Just like Richard Nixon's missing 18 minutes, there are gaps that occur, and the gaps are bigger than the parts that are covered. There's no way in current technology to cover someone's entire life from one end to another, so anything that we fabricate and put in as an actual existent moment of their lives could very well have been one. That's only one illustration of how we don't cover everything with complete accuracy, because it's not just covering the moment. It's also covering all the other moments to show in your documentation, just as in an argument in a story, that things are not only proven by what you see of them, but also showing that in other areas it did not occur in all other areas where it might have. You have to prove both that it did exist and also that something did exist and also that something else did not exist elsewhere. And so in order to show that Forest Gump was not really there with these presidents, we would have had to have a documentation of all of the time the presidents did anything during their administrations that was seamless, did not allow for a single moment in which that could have occurred. Now that seems like kind of a moot point, but it's really very important because the implications are that as we begin to create a technology that seems more and more real in documenting what actually apparently happened, we're also bringing ourselves right back to the verbal tradition of having people describe what they actually saw. And in fact, perhaps the most objective of all truths goes back to our the concept of folklore, and will actually become our modern folklore, so that as we see things that happen in front of us, that we perceive with our own senses in real time, sure, we can be mistaken, just as any lawyer knows dealing with the jury when dealing with eyewitnesses is that eyewitnesses can often be mistaken. But if you get enough eyewitnesses to enough different kinds of events, you establish something different than an objective external truth. You establish an objective internal truth. An objective internal truth is the collective appreciation or folklore that surrounds an individual, which means you can't trust any of the events that are talked about as actually having happened, no matter how many times they recur in the folklore. And you can't trust any of the statistics that are brought forth or the historic representations that are described. But what you can trust is that the mood surrounding that individual or that event or that period of history is accurately the way that people felt about it. Now, let's differentiate for a second. The way people felt about it, don't we all have different feelings? Yes, we do. But what we're saying is that the event itself had an essence. The event itself had emotional meaning, had an emotional truth. And the emotional truth, by taking all the different ways people felt about it that have gone into the collective folklore, we then get a sense of all the different points of view about this particular event, which leads us to an understanding of the kinds of feelings that this event generated in the populace at the time. Because of that, we can sense what the inner feeling was that was being generated just by getting a sense of how different people responded through the folklore that they told. Now, of course, in the Soviet Union, this has been a well-known concept, and that has led to, in years past, the development not only of changing the historic facts in textbooks for young children, but also in changing the way events were presented, in other words, the context, so that context has become a tool in the Soviet Union to adjust the way people thought about things, about facts that could not be denied. So when you can deny a fact, you do, but if it's something that you can't deny as fact, because it's just too well documented in too many places, then you deny its meaning, you deny its context. Now, here in the United States, being a completely Western-based thought world, as they say, when we try to document things, we try to take the connotation out. We leave out the entire emotional side. We call that bias. We call it editorialization. We won't allow it in our textbooks. We don't want to present that this was a good thing or a bad thing. If you look at some of the even-tempered, steady-handed approaches to some of the most despicable or wonderful events in the history of humankind in United States textbooks, you'll find that they lack spark, because they are trying to be so... This isn't a case of being politically correct, it's a case of being emotionally correct, which means emotionally neutral on issues and describing them only as facts, that all of the context is lost. And if we have a fragmentation of our current culture occurring, it's because we no longer allow things to be placed in context. We just want to know what they are and let everyone decide for themselves what they mean. This deadens the emotional nerves in all of us, and as a culture prevents us from having a unity of feeling about events. We experience the closest thing we get to this when we're rooting for our team in a sporting event. When we root for our team, then everyone who was for that team is supposed to experience the same emotional perspective, the same emotional context as to the advancement of the play and the conclusion of the game. However, that, of course, is divisive, as that we end up with at least two different factions, each of which feeling dynamically opposed to one another, which is no surprise in a Western society that we would end up with dynamic opposites being created out of the way in which spectators have been marshaled to support their sport. The point is that there is a holism of tendencies that pull things back into balance. And even when we send something as far out as that, it may create a society that is so biased or one-sided that it cannot even see the areas needed for equilibrium to bring them back into balance. But that will not last forever. Ultimately, the holism itself will respond in order to pull things back into balance, into equilibrium. And that's what we see as our technology that has sought to create an item of accuracy and has honed the ability to accurately portray what really happened. Along with that came the technology to portray things that never happened with as much apparent accuracy as in Forest Gump. Now that we have this, that's the force that's bringing things back into balance. It's creating meaningful contexts that never actually existed. and as such supplies a post-historical bias that is lacking in our doctrines of education today. So the modern folklore is not so much who did what in a mythologic sense, but it's becoming more of a sense of how did we feel about that in general. Just to note for whoever's transcribing this that the sections that pertain to a holism existing that such that when specificity can bring things out of balance, it can do so for only a limited duration of time. And then the holism will respond like a rubber band to pull things back into equilibrium. Those sections that pertain to that should be lifted and put into a separate document and made available to Chris, who's working on a story that deals with some of those thematic perspectives. Oh, just another final note before I sign off. We have a line in Steven Seagal's picture, On Deadly Ground, that I saw again in a trailer the other day that reminded me. He said to the head of the oil company, Michael Caine, "How much money is enough?" And of course that's a takeoff on the Native American philosophy that simply says, how much is enough? Because that's the question each one of us has to answer individually. But if we don't answer it, we just keep trying to get more and more and more. And you'll see that in the Russian folktale about the man who was offered the chance by native peoples that he came across to encircle any area of land he wanted, starting at dawn. And if he came back to the top of the hill where he started by sunset, before the sun went down, everything he'd walked around would be his and belong to him, possession-wise. And he started out in the morning, and then he would see one more thing he wanted to include, like an orchard or a stream for water that would be good for his cattle, or grazing lands, or whatever. He would make his circle larger and larger, until finally, as the sun started to go down, he realized that he would have to really run to try and get back. And he ran and he ran and he ran, and he saw that the sun had gone down and he didn't make it. But then he looked up at the top of the hill where he started, and the sun was still touching the top of the hill. So at that point, he said, I can still make it. I can have all of this. It wasn't so much a matter of greed, but it was a matter of how much was enough. And he ran up to the top of the hill, and by the time he got up there, he collapsed from exhaustion. They said, yes, you made it before the sun went down. All this land is yours. And then the guy died from exhaustion. So he gained it all, but he lost it all because he couldn't enjoy it. And the reason he couldn't enjoy it was he was constantly looking for more. Certainly this is a common thread in a lot of indigenous cultures. However, one thing that is not as often considered in indigenous cultures is the female perspective on the same issue. Even when we get away from Western philosophy, the female perspective is not nearly as well brought out in our folklore. And that concept is, how long is enough in terms of duration? How long do you have to put up with this? How long do you have to try something before you give up? Because the concept of giving up is in opposition to the male concept of standing against all odds. Men are always driven intrinsically at a tendency level, below the level of consciousness, to want to stand their ground, to want to stick with their resolve. They have a tendency to want to be a steadfast character. And most of the meaningful stories for men are either about characters who hold on against incredible external odds and remain steadfast and succeed, or who come up against external odds that are so incredible that it looks insurmountable. And then they realize that instead of standing stiff and breaking, they have to be flexible and bend. And when they bend, then they can succeed, because all the force rushes past them, then they're behind it and they hit it from behind. That's what happens in Star Wars. The change that Luke goes through in Star Wars is not so intrinsic a change in his nature, that he stops becoming Luke, stops being Luke. Instead, it is a change that that brings him to bend, to flex, and to say, okay, I won't hold on to this, but he's still going to try and destroy the Empire. He's still going to try and drop those bombs. All that stuff doesn't change. The only thing that changed is the fact that he is going to turn off his targeting computer and trust the Force. But his purposes didn't change. Far be it ever for a man's purposes to change in a story. But for women, the question is, how long do I put up with this? Because in order to stop putting up with something, to walk away from it, walking away from something, that's something that you see the closest male equivalent in Kung Fu and stories of that nature, where Cain attempts to walk away and attempts to walk away, but gosh darn it, Billy Jack, gosh darn it, no matter how much you walk away, they keep coming after you until there's no place left to walk, you're backed into a corner, and by golly, then you've got to remain steadfast, stand your ground, and fight anyway. The stories never end with somebody actually just walking away, and that solves the problem. The only time you get stories like that are ones like in Being There, where in the end, it's the doctor trying to stand his ground that this person's a fake and a fraud, and there's nothing that is intrinsically good about them. It's just a series of circumstances. And then the doctor finally gets what he believes is the proof that this fellow is a charlatan. But then he sees the benefits that this person had brought to the lives of others, that Peter Sellers had brought, Chancey Gardner. And when he sees that Chancey Gardner had brought these benefits, then he says, well, under the circumstances, in this context, I guess I'll just let things continue, and I will give up trying to bring this man down. So he gave up and let it happen. And then what do they do at the end of the story? Even though it's kind of magical within context, they show Chancey Gardner going out to a lake, a pond, and walking on water. Well, this is most amazing because it apparently makes him the real genuine article and means that the doctor was mistaken in thinking this person was a fraud. And in terms of the doctor being mistaken and that this person was a fraud, even though all the evidence pointed to it, even conclusively, then in that case it was right for the doctor to give up at that point because there were forces at work far beyond anything he could have imagined. So it lets them off the hook, and it lets all the men in the audience off the hook, and that's part of why the movie, I think, has appeal to a broad audience. Now, if you took a female perspective of these concepts, there doesn't have to be conclusive proof. There doesn't even have to be an overriding, clear dividing line between what is right and what is wrong. There doesn't have to be the sense that there is no way to overcome these forces as long as you try to stand your ground, but if you just let yourself relax, they'll flow past you, and then you can become stiff again, stand your ground, and go after them. No, it's a question of how long do you put up with it. Duration. You see, male time is explored in terms of sequence. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And sequence is really a form of order, and order is spatial. Sequence has nothing to do with the flow of time. It has to do with the order of events. And so you'll find that whenever you're dealing with male perspectives, that's why you come up with the concept of the word in the English language of something being long. How long was it? Long is a word that means a spatial measurement of how much ground does it cover, and also how much temporal ground does it cover, how much time does it cover. But it was 3 hours long. Well, they divided up into segments and determined how many of them constitute the length. That's supposed to be objective time. There is no objective time from a female perspective. From a female perspective, it's all a matter of duration. I don't even want to use the word long, but there isn't anything else in the English language. How long did something feel? No, it's more like how many cycles did it go through? I guess that's the... But certainly no woman in the world is going to get in touch with that intuitively. I can't even. It's how many repetitions do you go through before you come to the conclusion that nothing's changing? That's really the question. So how many repetitions do you go through before you determine nothing's changing? And that's the female story. And you do see that in female motion pictures, pictures for women, pictures by women especially. That is a side of appreciating time that creates something, when seen from a male perspective, we could call stretchy time. In other words, the time duration in terms of segments of time, like hours and minutes, that's not so important, because all the events in one's life have cycles attached to them where they repeat. And all these simple repeating waveforms come together over the period of a person's life, which is a duration, to create a complex waveform, because there are some cycles that are only beginning by the time we die. For example, if you look at the growth of a redwood tree, that's not going to be completed during our lifetime. You can see redwood trees in various stages of development, but that development is so slow we really can't watch it change. Because we can't watch it change, we do not, as women, sense any emotional value. It only has one value, unchanging. We don't see that one breed of tree changes at a different rate from another breed of tree. We can't really tell that the mountains are eroding at a different rate than the galaxies are colliding. It's not something that we can get a sense of, because the cycles are so slow that the curve, in the context of our life, of the length of our lives, the curve of that cycle going up and going down appears to be a straight line, appears flat. We can't really get a sense of it. Now, there are cycles of all kinds of varying degrees, and in fact, there are some cycles that come and go, so that even though they always have the same cycle, they're not always there. It's this complex web of cyclic interference and interaction that creates the synthesized, non-repetitive waveform of each of our individual lives. So when we are examining an issue, the first thing a woman's going to do is see if this is something that looks like it can change or not change, and if it's good or bad. I guess the first thing would be, do I like this or do I not like this? That's the first evaluation. Now, is it going to go away or is it not going to go away? And that requires knowing what time frame you're talking about. And the time frame, then, is not so much, is it going to go away or not within a particular period of time? Because that objective time has no meaning for a female perspective. Rather, it's how many times do I have to go through this before it stops, if it's bad? Or how many times do I get to enjoy this before I have to relegate it to memory, if it's good? So, looking at the flow of stories, looking at the flow of logic, looking at the ways in which Western society and even Eastern society, complex societies and indigenous societies are created, they are mostly focused on the male perspective and only begin at the most indigenous levels, the most holistic levels of, say, Native Americans and I wish I knew more about the culture, so I'll have to explore and relegate this to Peter, I suppose, because he's done a lot of research in that area. But the concept of cycles, how many moons, okay, how many seasons, these things appear to be repetitive cycles that one can count on, but from a male perspective, they are completely repetitive, never ending. The female perspective is to look for cycles as their yardstick that are not repetitive, but are ending, and to say, how long will this cycle run? How many cycles will these things go through before they finally cease, so that I should build up for the winter time by enjoying the cycles that are positive while they're here, and I should steel myself and not react immediately to the negativism of the cycles that are negative cycles, because I can see that they're going to diminish and go away. The one thing that women can't see from this perspective, they cannot see, is that sometimes cycles show no sign of diminishing of getting less and less in amplitude, or greater and greater amplitude as they come online. They don't show any signs of this. They go along as if they are repetitive cycles, in other words, straight lines, like something exists like a redwood tree, and suddenly they're cut down. That suddenly some of these cycles just stop without any prior indication. That's something that male perspectives can deal with quite easily. All of a sudden something just stops. All of a sudden something just starts, because it's a binary appraisal. It's a limit line. On this side it doesn't exist, on that side it does. But limit lines like that don't work for females. And so in our culture we're lacking the tools in our math and in our science and in our culture, in our laws, in our religion. We're lacking the perspectives that talk about these cycles as diminishing down until they become nothing and building up until they become something, to be able to say, how many cycles do I have to endure before I don't have to endure it anymore because I can't perceive it anymore? And so as we get into relationships and determine how many infidelities we can tolerate, it's not trying to come up with a number and say, when you cross this line, it's over. It's for a woman trying to get a sense of how many of these infidelities she can go through before she cannot take it anymore. And that sense comes into play as a stronger emotion about the cycle itself. So rather than looking objectively, if we looked objectively at the situation, rather than looking at it as the infidelities increasing or decreasing, we could look at it as the woman's feelings increasing or decreasing about the infidelities. She subjectively will look at it as the hurt that's being put upon her as increasing or decreasing. And there's a lot of understanding in this that can be put to bear on the concept of PMS, when nothing externally appears to be changing, and yet internally a woman perceives things as getting worse or getting better, depending. There's euphoria attached with PMS that there's not too much talk about that can also occur. It's really more of an amplifier than it is a directional vector, and simply means that as the hormonal balance shifts prior to menstruation, it tends to amplify one's reading of cycles that one's already monitoring. And if they were bad, they appear to get worse fast. And if they were good, they appear to get better fast. And you ride on a wave of euphoria or depression, depending upon the positive or negative nature and the true value or absolute value of it being positive or negative for non-PMS times. That will then influence how far and how fast it's rated. All the inequities of one's life start glaring at you more strongly, and all of the good times start becoming more powerful. But because you also have the ability to look to your memory, you can look back and see good times that are no longer there and feel a great sense of loss, which leads to depression. Anyway, all of these concepts lead back to those waveforms. And then the end of this discussion ties in neatly with the beginning of a discussion that I put on, I think, the beginning of this tape the other day, talking about the relationships between people in terms of the waveforms and phasing in and out as we grow, as we change, and the difference between each individual's growth pattern and the waveform created as a synthesis between their growth patterns that may remain stable over many, many years, or they may phase in and out, sometimes hating each other, sometimes loving each other, and in fact moving in and out of dependent, companion, and dynamic relationships between them, even as they grow in ways that might be positive for both, or negative for both, or neutral for both. Anyway, if we take whatever I put on the beginning of this tape, which was that thought about the inner relationships between people, and splice it on to the end of this discussion, which just began to lead into waveforms, I think that would be a better way to editorialize this for presentation to whoever's transcribing this material. I think that's enough for today.